Alright, Gadgeteers, welcome back. So I had a little bit of a problem recording the first video, so if it looks like I'm looking into the wrong camera, that's probably because I am. I actually have two cameras set up. I've got my webcam set up as usual, my 4K Logitech, and I have my 4K Sony AX53, which I still need to do a video on because it's a great camera. And I also have a lavalier on as a backup audio because for some reason my blue snowball microphone keeps on dying on me, and then it's not found in the USB devices and I end up having to reboot. So short story here, I have done an update on my system and rebooted. We'll see if that works. I checked the cable. I don't think it's the cable. Let's carry on. This video is actually about the Yoga 920 laptop, which you see behind me here. And this particular laptop was one that I have used for a year now. And actually, I bought it in February of 2018. And I found it to be an excellent laptop. What I wanted to talk about was how it's going with the hardware and the functionality. And then secondly, we'll talk about how things are going with using Fedora Linux on the laptop and how everything's going software-wise. First thing I wanted to mention is I did sell the MacBook Pro 2017 13.3 inch that I had. I did like the design and the chassis, and I do like Mac OS, and I found it very usable. However, I decided to get rid of it because, quite frankly, I'm to the point now where I'm only using Linux. I don't need Windows anymore for my job, so my primary operating system I use is Linux. And that MacBook Pro just kind of sat there collecting dust, so I was happy to sell it to a friend, and I'm really glad that they're going to have a great use of it, something I just don't need. Second thing, the Yoga 920, as I've mentioned, is my primary system now. So again, that's what I use, and I'm in Linux 100% of the time at this point. I guess that's not quite fair. I'll go with 99% because sometimes I do play a game or two in Windows. I still think it's the easiest and best way to get it going, so I just go ahead and load Windows and play the game. Let's talk a little bit about Linux. Well, no, I'm sorry. Let's talk a little bit first about the Yoga 920 likes and dislikes. So the likes list is pretty long, as you can imagine. The first thing that I think is really nice about the unit is the USB-A port. I use that an awful lot, and I think it's going to be a few years yet before things are changed over to USB-C, so it's nice to have that feature. Secondly, the two USB slots are actually nice, although what would be nice is having one additional USB-A port, but we'll get into that later. The other thing that's good is they're Thunderbolt 3, so there are 4 PCIe lanes on the Thunderbolt 3 port, and I haven't had a use for it yet, but if I ever wanted to run an external video card, I could do that. It's not the best. It's not like having a desktop system, but it's decent. I really like the 4K screen. I feel like it's an excellent screen for the things that I do. If you compare the 4K to the MacBook Pro's Retina, you will see a definite difference depending on how good your eyesight is. With my glasses, of course, I'm 20/20, so I can see a significant improvement in the clarity, and you got to see them side by side and decide for yourself, but there's definitely a difference. The Retina is just a little bit more fuzzy. It's not a bad screen, and I'm definitely not disparaging it, but it's not as good as the 4K screen is in the Yoga 920. I do like the battery life in Fedora. I get about 6 to 7 hours of real-time usage. Now, let me just explain what I mean by real-time usage. When I say that, I mean using the system at approximately anywhere from 70 to 85% brightness, running processor-intensive applications like consuming video or other media, editing video, transferring files back and forth between the system, And about 2/3 of the time I'm doing that, and about 1/3 of the time I may be writing text, so doing some text development or editing a thumbnail or an image. But the majority of my testing period, about 2/3, is definitely media consumption. So I definitely get a real world time. So if you see 12 to 14 hours as the manufacturer's recommended time, I'm actually saying, well, in real world use, more like 6 to 7 hours, which for me is definitely good enough. The chassis is beautiful. I think it's equally as good as any MacBook. I know they don't carry their resale value, but the Yoga 920 and my Yoga 910 before it were beautiful systems, and I think they're definitely of equal quality to a MacBook. Maybe just slightly less, but it is an all-metal chassis. It's aluminum, and it's beautiful. One of the things they did with the Yoga 920, which is a dislike, is they decided to make the chassis, I think they call it iron gray, and you can get a wine colored, but you cannot get, there may be another color, but you can't get a silver anymore. And I really loved the Yoga 910 in silver, and I had my MacBooks in silver. That was my favorite color. The new iron gray with the Yoga 920 is kind of like space gray with the MacBook, and I just wish that Lenovo would try a little harder not to follow Apple and go ahead and do their own thing with design and layout. I know they think, well, if we do this and follow the Mac design, then we'll be okay. We'll sell more units. Well, maybe they should venture out and be a leader instead of a follower. Hands down, the main reason that I bought this system was the 4-core 8th generation i7 processor. It has truly 4 cores with 8 threads, unlike the Yoga 910, which had 2 cores, 4 threads. It makes a huge difference with video editing in Kdenlive, and it cut my render time by about 40 to 50%. Now, I do have a video when I first bought the Yoga 920. The main reason that I purchased it was because of the processor. I was gone for about 3 weeks with my wife. She was on assignment for her job, and we had to stay in a hotel. So I bought some miniature lights that I could take with me on the road, nice and lightweight. And the Yoga 920 I bought because I wanted something faster. It also has 16 gigabytes of RAM, which I think is really helpful. So if you're going to buy a laptop today and you can afford it, I definitely recommend the 16 gigabytes of RAM. The keyboard is good. I won't call it the best, but it's good. Believe it or not, I like the MacBook Pro version 2 or probably version 3 keyboard. I can type very, very fast. I am a touch typist, so I don't need to look at the system in particular when I'm typing, and I could go really fast with the MacBook. The keyboard is more of a standard chiclet keyboard, so it's definitely a good keyboard, and it's good enough for me, but it's not as good as other keyboards, you know, and you might want to look around and definitely always want to test the keyboard before you buy. I really like the watch band hinge on the unit. I think it looks really classy. And believe it or not, the microphone is halfway decent. So here you have it, the glorious cam in 720p and the microphone that's built in, which I think, you know, if I'm out on the road or whatever, if I'm in the hospital again, hopefully not, but it's a possibility. I could do some recording. I could just put the laptop up and just go to town. Normally what I do, of course, is not full screen because the camera isn't all that great. So what I do in OBS, I have a couple of different scenes. I've got one I call Cam Large, where basically I've got the camera here up in the corner, which you can see, and I've got all my activities here on the screen that I'm doing. And I usually set hotkeys, but I haven't gotten around to it yet in the Yoga 920 because I did do a clean install of Fedora 29. Then, of course, I have the full cam, which you saw, and then I have the smaller camera settings so that if I've got a browser window open, it doesn't, my pretty face doesn't occlude what the activity is that we're doing on the web browser. And of course, I have one last one in OBS, which is desktop only, so you can't see my ugly mug. So that was the microphone and the 720p webcam. What did you think? I'm not really a big fan of the webcam. I think it's decent, but it's not the greatest. The microphone, on the other hand, not too bad. It's obviously not as good as a lavalier microphone, which I can plug directly into the laptop, or a USB microphone, or a nicer Rode microphone. So let's talk about the dislikes. I feel like the trackpad is less qualitative than the trackpad in the Yoga 910. The click has more travel and it's much louder. That seems like a trivial thing, but you know, I'm imagining, well, okay, my wife is sleeping and I'm sitting here working on my computer. The Yoga 910 has less travel and a more tactile click and about half the loudness of the click in the Yoga 910. The Yoga 910. The Yoga 920. Storage and memory are soldered in. This is kind of a bummer that the whole industry is moving towards this, but what does that mean? Well, you have to buy what you want. You cannot upgrade the memory. You can't upgrade the storage. So unfortunately, it's something you have to buy at the get-go. I decided to get the 4K screen, the 16 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigabytes of storage. The reason I mention it is because really the storage, honestly, I could have used 1 terabyte, even more. I have my SSD split into 2 operating systems, of course. I've went ahead and set up Windows in a 200 gigabyte partition, and then the remainder, 300 gigs or so, is set up for Fedora. So I can pretty much fill it up with my video editing fairly quickly, and that includes using the Windows partition as part-time storage. Let's switch to software. So let me look at my handy dandy list here. What do I like about Fedora and the Yoga 920? Well, first things first, installing Fedora 920 is much easier than installing Fedora on the Yoga 910. Now, with the newer versions of Fedora, it may be a non-issue, but I did have to do quite a few tweaks on the Yoga 910 to get it to install. Now, I have a video on that, so if you go to my channel, FastGadgets, all one word, you can check it out, and it'll help you do an installation of Fedora, possibly other versions of Linux, because there are some BIOS things that you need to change. The other thing is the stability. Now, as far as my Linux systems go, it's got to be the most stable system. Let's establish and define the word stability and what I mean. What I mean is, once the system is booted up and I'm using it, there are no crashes. I have not had any driver issues when I do updates. I have not had any freezes on the system or kernel panics, which you know is basically a blue screen in Windows. It's been absolutely stable and wonderful. I really enjoy using the system, and I know I can rely on it 100%. I really like that. I like that in Fedora, and this isn't so much a Yoga 920 thing as it is a Fedora thing, that I can do the updates when I want to do the updates and how I want to do them. I can use the GUI if I want. I choose to use the command line. To me, it's just faster and easier, but you don't have to. You can use the GUI, and that includes OS updates. It also includes major operating system upgrades. So if you're going from an older version of Fedora to a newer one, you're in luck. You can do it in the GUI. It's fairly simple. You just go to the Software Center. It'll tell you if one's available. Bam, you do the update. You're in business. Most of the applications work just fine with Fedora. What do I mean by that? Well, I haven't really had any problems with the apps except for one, and to be fair, I have not done an update, so I really don't know if it's something that an update will help. It's been about a month since I last did updates on the Yoga 920. What the problem is if I double click a video and launch VLC, it works perfectly fine. But if I double click, well, if I close VLC and then double click a different video or the same one again, it doesn't really matter, just a video, the process will spawn and start up, but nothing appears on the screen, and I end up having to issue a kill command. So it's pretty drastic. It just doesn't respond any other way, so I end up having to kill the process. Now, if I run VLC on the other hand, and I take my videos and drag them into VLC, it runs perfectly fine, and then I can switch back and forth between the videos and do anything I want and just pop them into the list. So I consider it a minor issue, not a major issue, and I just carry on when I use VLC by putting what videos I want to check out when I'm doing video editing into the list, and then go look at them after the fact. I use KDE Desktop, which I really like. It scales really well, and that's important for me. Now, there are some manual settings that you have to adjust to get 4K scaling to work right, but of the desktop environments that I've tried, which is very few actually, just KDE and GNOME, and yes, it's really pronounced GNOME, believe it or not. It is not the same thing as the gnome statue you have in your garden. That is pronounced gnome, but GNOME is software you install in Linux. Let's get back to it. What else do I have on my list? I'm able to play older games fairly well in Linux, and I should have mentioned in the hardware section that it does not have a discrete GPU. Unfortunately, it has a built-in GPU that's part of the Intel chip, and I don't remember. I think it's the Intel HD 620 or something like that. I say something like that because you know as well as I do, the changes in the Intel HD are incremental in number, but that doesn't mean that they make great strides in performance. You might get 2 or 3 more frames with each iteration, so what does it really matter that much? Anyway, I have played Left 4 Dead 2. I use Proton in the Steam installer, and I was able to get Left 4 Dead running. I haven't tried any other games yet, but I think I'm going to try Fallout 3, which I was using in Windows, and I'd like to see if I can use Proton to get it working. I tried to do that on my desktop, but I haven't been successful in getting any games to run under Proton, and I'm not sure why, but it's something I'll have to work on. Now, one thing is my desktop is running Fedora 28, whereas the Yoga 920 is running Fedora 29. Not sure how many updates were done and major upgrades to Fedora 29, but it might be just enough. Why haven't I upgraded my desktop yet to Fedora 29? Well, I like to do testing with Fedora 29 on my laptop first and make sure everything's working okay before I decide to jump to the latest version of Fedora, because it is my main editing rig, and I try not to upset the apple cart. I've had good success doing Fedora upgrades, and it hasn't been an issue, but you got to be realistic. If you're running a business, of course, you don't take all your systems and just do a kamikaze upgrade on all the systems and hope for the best. You do proper testing before you roll up critical key systems. That's just how you do it. So most productivity applications work perfectly fine for me in Fedora and in the KDE desktop environment. What are some examples? Well, Firefox works fine and Steam works fine. I'm looking at my desktop here because I use the same applications on my desktop that I actually use on Fedora, or excuse me, the Yoga 920. Gov-C View to set up my video settings and get the camera set up exactly the way I want it to. OBS to do recording, of course, Kdenlive for my video editing, Audacity for any audio editing that I may need to do, LibreOffice, which I am forcing myself to use exclusively because I did plenty of teaching and training for Microsoft Office, but depending on if I'm going to be able to go back to work with my heart condition, I really don't know yet. I have several surgeries coming up, and I have videos regarding that you can check out on my channel. But depending on my situation, I may lose my license to Microsoft Office, which won't break my heart because I found Libre is suitable and doing everything I need it to do, so I'll just continue using LibreOffice. So let's talk about the dislikes with Fedora Linux on the Yoga 920. Well, first of all, I can't believe this is a thing, but it's a thing. Linux sucks on scaling 4K screens. It truly is a pitiful state of affairs that years after 4K screens have come out, you're still better off using 1080p or just going ahead and running your 4K screen in 1080p if you don't want to do the work of getting the scaling set up correctly. GNOME is not really that good at all with 4K. I don't care what anybody says. It takes a tremendous amount of work, and even though you get the desktop environment scaled correctly, it doesn't mean that you're going to have applications scaled correctly. Each one could have individual issues, so it's a real downside. KDE is pretty good at scaling both the applications and the desktop environment, but you still have to do manual settings to get it set up correctly. And that, to me, is silly. It should be able to do proper scaling with a 4K screen like Windows does. It's one of those basic things that should be doable. I still, on a 4K screen, have to just kind of memorize what the toolbar is in GIMP, for example, because they are just tiny. So I memorize where they are and what they do versus knowing what I'm actually clicking on by looking at the icon in the toolbar. It's simply ridiculous. Steam is another one. The screen is literally that big. So what do? I run the magnifier so that I can see Steam on my 4K screen because it's so tiny. It's insane. But that's the way it is right now. You're going to have to do a little work if you decide to buy 4K. I've had users say, why don't you just run it in 1080p? I'm like, go back to the hardware section where I explained that how sharp 4K is. When you take a 4K screen and run it in 1080p, I think it looks a little bit worse than a 1080p screen running in 1080p. Just saying. So why do I buy the 4K? Because it looks really good and it's easier on my eyes. So that's my opinion. That's why I get it. So you will have minor problems from time to time. It is an operating system, and just like Windows and Mac OS, you can expect to have occasional problems. Not as many as Mac OS. Well, okay, Mac OS is pretty stable, pretty decent, although you are kind of locked into this beautiful walled garden that you dare not step out of. Windows 10, lots more problems, deleting people's files and really fun, cool stuff like that. Well, you don't get that in Fedora, in my opinion. It works wonderfully, and I don't see any kind of major data loss or anything like that. So consider that. Now, the MacBook Pro that I used to have, the 2017, did have an issue where there was a firmware problem where it could lose your files and data, which is weird, and it needed to be sent in for a firmware update. You could not do the firmware update yourself. Apple had to do it. You either had to get an appointment and take it to an Apple store, or you unfortunately had to the laptop in. Well, I haven't had that issue with the Yoga 920. I have done one firmware update on it, which went perfectly fine, and I did it myself, and it was easy. I'm having one other software issue with the Yoga 920. For some reason, my KDE rendering has suddenly slowed down considerably. I did figure out what the problem was. If you go into Windows and hit the Function plus Q key, you'll see that that particular key combination will turn on turbo mode or quiet mode. With the Yoga 910, many people complained about the sound of the fans, so they created this quiet mode. Unfortunately, the quiet mode slows down things like rendering by about 50%, so it's very, very slow in comparison. Now, one thing to mention on the Yoga 920, if you hit the Function Q key while you're in Linux, it will actually put it into quiet mode, and it will not go back into turbo mode. In order to do that, you have to go back into Windows and hit Function Q and make sure you see the turbo icon appear on the screen. Of course, if you're doing video editing, the desktop is the thing. That's where you're going to want to do all your editing. It's just so much more fast. It's so much more resilient, especially with 4K. I don't have as many hiccups or problems or issues. I could render 4K, but we're talking about a lot more time. You know, I have the 2K render wars that I did, and I found that the Ryzen 2700X desktop is leaps and bounds faster. And I'll put that chart up here so you can have a look at it, but it's definitely way faster than the Yoga 920. So, you know, with any type of laptop, you're probably going to get some thermal throttling. Of course, you're not going to have as high a clock speed on the processor. The memory clock speed is not going to be as high, and, you know, its purpose really is miniaturization and performance as opposed to performance first. So that's about what I wanted to cover. If you're looking to run Fedora on a Yoga 920 or a Yoga 910, you'll find that it runs really well. Again, it's extremely stable. I'm fairly certain if you were interested in running Ubuntu or Linux Mint or Arch or any of those other distributions, you probably would have the same essential effect. It would be wonderful to run. So I do recommend trying out Linux. One thing to consider is that I'm doing a dual boot, so you don't have to scratch off Windows completely if you want to be able to use Windows still and do a dual boot. But the best way to learn Linux is to jump in. If you try to do virtual machines, you're not forced to use Linux, and when you're not forced to do it, you simply won't learn it. I get a lot of comments after I make these videos saying, well, I don't need to know Linux. Why do I need to know Linux? I'm fine with Windows or Mac OS. If you're fine with it, then carry on. But if you're interested in Linux, the Linux community, Linux servers, and you want to support those or learn more about Linux so that you can enhance your IT perspective if you're in the IT career area, you're definitely going to want to know Linux, and you want to have personal knowledge of it, not book smart knowledge like, yes, I know what Linux is. It's an alternative operating system. That's wonderful. But have you ever tried to run any software on it? And, well, no, I haven't. So you don't have that experience, and you may not be considered for the position. Linux is definitely out there. We know that most of the servers are running Linux, and it's changed a lot. There used to be some Windows servers, mainly Unix servers, and there were some IBM servers, which they're still out there, like the AS400 with the RISC processors. So there's still some of those, but Linux has taken over essentially the server environment. So if you think you're going to be working on servers, put it on your desktop. Learn about Linux now so that you can say you have some experience with it. It looks good on the resume. Alright, that about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. If you really liked it, support the channel. Consider joining me on Patreon for about $1 a month. Or if you want, just give me a comment and let me know if you like the video and if there's any improvements I can make. I always appreciate constructive comments. It definitely helps me out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.